Welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. On this YouTube channel, I offer thoughtful responses to skeptical objections to the Christian faith. I likewise edify the saints by equipping them to provide an answer for the hope that lies within them. I hope that you find value in my work. Please like my videos, send me comments, and please subscribe. Let's work together to contend earnestly for the faith that's been once for all delivered to the saints. You have found Blessed Man Meditations, where we provide answers to the intellectual side of Christianity and equip Christians to provide a defense for the hope that is in them, according to 1 Peter 3:15. Today we continue our look at Is Atheism Dead?, the book by Eric Metaxas. Eric Metaxas is a best-selling author whose books have been translated into 25 languages. Eric Metaxas hosts a nationally syndicated radio show and an acclaimed conversation series, Socrates in the City. He is a prominent cultural commentator whose work has appeared in the likes of the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, the Wall Street Journal. There's an address down there for an article that Metaxas had in the Wall Street Journal some time ago, showing how science makes a case for God, and he has gone to great lengths in part one of Is Atheism Dead? To demonstrate how science makes a convincing argument for the existence of God. Today, on Blessed Man Meditations, we look at Chapter 7 of Is Atheism Dead? By Eric Metaxas, where we see that life is more complex than we thought. When Darwin and others in the 19th century and early 20th centuries talked about cells, all they knew was that cells were exceedingly tiny things containing something called protoplasm, which was a nonsense placeholder word for what they didn't know, much as ether was postulated as being a substance everywhere in outer space, although now we know there is no such thing. So it was with protoplasm. Here is a definition for protoplasm. Protoplasm is generally used to refer to the living parts of a cell, but can have slightly different meanings in different circles. The term protoplasm is not often used these days, however, due to the fact that it was initially used to imply that a cell only contains two components, a nucleus and a simple homogeneous cytoplasm. Nowadays, we know that the cytoplasm is very complex and that it contains intricate organelles. Nevertheless, in eukaryotes, such as plants and animals, we now refer to the protoplasm outside of the nucleus as the cytoplasm, and the protoplasm inside the nucleus is the nucleoplasm. In prokaryotes, the contents of a cell are collectively called the cytoplasm. Well, the first component of the protoplasm is the cytoplasm. That's between the cell membrane and the nucleus. In eukaryotes, organelles are within the protoplasm. The second element in the makeup of the protoplasm is the nucleus. And this is where the genetic material of the cell is, in the nucleus. The nucleus is where ribosomes are made. Ribosomes create proteins in the cell. You can go to Biology Dictionary and find this page for protoplasm. It was just a term to denote an idea. Protoplasm was just a term to denote an idea. Words have power, and speaking with confidence of protoplasm made everyone comfortable until with powerful microscopes we eventually saw there was no such thing as protoplasm. The innards of a cell were actually breathtakingly complicated. Cells are more complicated than we originally thought. What we once thought was a simple membrane surrounding some gooey protoplasm was now seen to contain an astonishing universe within itself, a staggering agglomeration of intertwined parts performing stunningly complex functions. Even the membrane was outrageously sophisticated, being perfectly watertight until it somehow chose to allow something in or out, and then did so. The more science learned, the more clear it became that a single cell was anything but simple. And the more it became obvious that something so impossibly sophisticated didn't appear to have to come into existence by mere chance. Already in 1978, the evolutionist and Cambridge zoologist W.H. Thorpe said that even the most elementary type of cell constitutes a mechanism unimaginably more complex than any machine yet thought up, let alone constructed by man, end quote by Thorpe. Exactly how complex is hard to comprehend. The information in the DNA of a single bacterium alone is equivalent to the millions of words in a shelf of 20 books. The building blocks of DNA and RNA are called nucleotides, which are each involved in signaling, metabolism, and enzyme reactions. Each nucleotide consists of 3 parts: a phosphate group, a 5-carbon sugar, and a nitrogenous base. The smallest bacterium in existence has 5,375 nucleotides. Other bacteria have 3 million nucleotides. So how can we really comprehend the complexity of even the simplest cell, which we once thought simply to be a membrane surrounding some jelly-like protoplasm? And how is it exactly that these endless numbers of nucleotides are themselves programmed to do the complex things they do? We know that they are somehow programmed, but how are they programmed? And how can we dare to imagine that cells of such inestimable complexity just happened to show up through the random sloshing of waters on the surface of the early Earth? Because that is precisely what has continuously been proposed over the decades, albeit with increasingly less exuberant enjoyment of life. In his book, The Cosmic Blueprint, physicist Paul Davies says, it is possible to perform rough calculations of the probability that the endless breakup and reforming of the soup's complex molecules would lead to a small virus after 1 billion years. Davies then tells us what those calculations lead to. Davies says they work out at one chance in 10 to the 2 millionth power, a mind-numbing number, which put more simply would be harder to achieve than just happening to flip heads on a coin 6 million times in a row. For anyone who has flipped heads on a coin 10 times in a row, you get the idea. Davies concludes by saying the spontaneous generation of life by random molecular shuffling is a ludicrously improbable event. In other words, life is not going to create itself by random processes. But since Davies made these observations, the time in which we know life to have come into being has shrunk tenfold, from roughly 1 billion years down to 100 million. So whatever difficulty he's talking about must now be multiplied by 10. Once again, the more time passes and the more science discovers, the worse the problem of the origin of life gets. There is a Franz Kafka short story titled Before the Law, in which a man tries for many years to gain entry to the law, presumably to speak with a judge. It is a classic Kafka, and if you know Kafka, you can imagine how it goes. First of all, the guard at the door says the man cannot go in. Then the fearsome guard explains that even if this man were somehow able to sneak past him in this door, there are many doors beyond this through which he must pass, and each of them is guarded by a guard much more powerful than the previous. So the guard explains that the man may not pass. Of course, without giving any reason, it says that the man may wait if he likes and indicates a stool where the man may sit. And so the man sits and waits. And waits. But he is never granted entry past this first guard. Eventually, years pass. Remember, this is Kafka. And as they do, the man's chances to get to the judge seem to dwindle. This is what we have come to call a Kafkaesque experience. Finally, when the man's very old and still sitting there waiting to be permitted entry, he finds himself pleading with the fleas on the guard's fur collar, hoping that they perhaps can help him. And then, of course, he dies. depending on the mood of the reader, the story can be either depressing or hilariously funny because in its 2 short pages, it sums up the experience most of us have had with one thing or another. It also describes exactly where science now stands regarding its long-assumed theories of how life began. How then did life come into being? One suggests it was always here, as they used to suggest that the universe was always here. Everyone agrees that there was a time when it did not exist at all, and then it suddenly did. What happened? Now we're going to look at the impossible complexity of cells. While we're pondering the most important of all questions, let's return to the outrageous complexity of the simplest life. The geneticist, Michael Denton, writes, quote, although the tiniest bacterial cells are incredibly small, weighing less than point several zeros in a 1 gram, each is in effect a veritable micro-miniaturized factory containing thousands of exquisitely designed pieces of intricate molecular machinery made up of 100 billion atoms, far more complicated than any machinery built by man and absolutely without parallel in the non-living world, end quote. Many scientists have come to the conclusion that what the Miller-Urey experiment suggested cannot be how life first arose. The Nobel-winning Belgian biochemist Christian Davies, pictured below, who specialized in origin of life research, rejected the chance hypothesis precisely because he judged the necessary fortuitous convergence of events implausible in the extreme. In the book A Meaningful World, written by Benjamin Wilker and Jonathan Witt, Wilker and Witt say that a cell of the most minimal function would contain at least 250 genes and their corresponding proteins. The odds of a primordial soup randomly burping up a concoction even half its length are vastly lower than 1 chance in 10 to the 150th power. The numbers are so outrageous that, again, they can seem comedic. We have to be able to laugh because nothing else will really suffice facing the hopelessness of scaling a sheer cliff reaching to what amounts to infinity. But many scientists, even now, remain unwilling to concede the reality of the situation. They seem philosophically unable to accept the idea that life didn't create itself out of nothing despite the mountainous evidence. The most well-known living atheist, Richard Dawkins, has often been quoted as saying that biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose, end quote. Of course, this too can sound unintentionally funny, as when Chico Marx asks the pearl-wearing dowager Margaret Dumont, who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes? What is it about the often seemingly self-explanatory and obvious appearance of design that must not be believed no matter what? So people like Dawkins say that complicated things give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. But right after saying that, they go to extreme lengths to convince themselves and others that what appears to be design isn't really design. Don't believe the obvious that it's design. Believe the ridiculous that it's not design. That's what Dawkins and others would have us do. Can Dawkins and others make the case that it's not design? They've certainly tried. And a half-century before Dawkins, there were James Watson and Francis Crick, who in 1953 discovered the magnificently complex and spiral of the DNA molecule. It was a milestone moment in the triumphal march of science, but Crick was obviously deeply concerned that what he had discovered might give the wrong impression, an impression of design, and swiftly directed his fellow biologists to vigilantly, quote, keep in mind that what you see was not designed, but rather evolved, end quote. So just like Dawkins says, even though it appears designed, we must continue to tell ourselves that it wasn't designed. It seems to be harder to believe that it wasn't designed, because even people like Dawkins and Crick who don't believe in a designer. They want to quickly use language that speaks of design because it seems to be common sense to work in the idea of design for something complex like this, because it seems somewhat preposterous to think that randomness can produce such complexity. Yeah, it's not what it looks like. It certainly looks like design, but we have to keep telling ourselves that it's not what it looks like. I can explain, I tell you. But as Stephen Meyer explains in his book, it's profoundly ironic because it's precisely due to what Watson and Crick discovered that the materialist understanding of life has begun to unravel. Meyer calculates the odds of a single functional protein or a single functional gene coming into existence via random processes based upon recent experiments in molecular biology, establishing the extreme rarity of functional proteins in relation to the total number of possible arrangements of amino acids corresponding to a protein of a given length. And what did Meyer find out? Essentially, that the odds of this ever having occurred are so astronomically high, we can once and for all be certain that it never happened. It never happened that a single functional protein came into existence via random processes, says Stephen Meyer. To put it in Meyer's own words, the probability of producing even a single functional protein of modest length, a length of 150 amino acids, by chance alone, in a prebiotic environment, stands at no better than a vanishingly small 1 chance in 10 to the 164th power. Meyer's a scientist. He happens to be a Christian, but he is a scientist. That is, of course, 1 chance in 1, followed by 164 zeros. In other words, it didn't happen. Of course, Meyer was only calculating what it would take for one single functioning protein to come into being, but the simplest living cell contains hundreds of specialized proteins, all performing their own tasks. How can all that have come into being from random molecules bouncing around? And how did they fail to fall in line? And how did they fall in line to perform that staggering variety of tasks? The more you know about what goes on in a cell, the more you goggle. It gets increasingly absurd that these things would come together randomly and perform the specific functions they do that are essential to life. That they would do so randomly is absurd. It seems obvious that intelligence is required. Now we're going to hear from Dr. James Tour, the nanoscientist. He is an origin of life scientist, and he is coming against the false narrative that is put out by many origin of life researchers. Many times the minority, like Dr. Tour, is he which is telling the truth, but the majority wants to try to silence him, and that seems to be what's happening with Dr. Tour. The more I listen to him lecture. As we mentioned, Rice University's James Tour is widely regarded as the greatest nanochemist on the planet. Tour's awards and credentials bear this out. In 2009, Tour was named one of the top 10 chemists in the world for the previous decade, and in 2013, R&D magazine named Tour the top scientist of the year. Tour holds joint appointments in the departments of chemistry, computer science, materials science, and nanoengineering, and has more than 700 research publications and over 140 patents. So, Tour is an accomplished scientist. He knows what he's talking about. It is hard to overstate the stature in the field. His stature. It is hard to overstate Tour's stature in the field of nanoscience, which includes nanobiology, nanochemistry, and nanoengineering. Tor's Jewish, born in Manhattan and grew up in the New York area. So when Tor visited New York City, Tor met Metaxas at the 2nd Avenue Deli in Manhattan. Just before their matzo ball soup arrived, Tor thrust his phone at Metaxas unannounced and clicked on the unappetizing video of a white rat whose spinal column had been purposely severed at the C5 vertebrae so that it was paralyzed from the neck down. Tor explained to Metaxas that using graphene nanotubes bisected lengthwise into what looks like noodles, albeit on an impossibly microscopic scale, Tor has created tiny bridges over which nerves can and actually do regrow. As Metaxas watched the video, Metaxas soon saw the same rat utterly restored. Tor explained that in less than 2 weeks, the nerves from opposite sides of the severed vertebrae grew over the graphene and linked, enabling the rodent to control its limbs again. It seemed a miracle. But Tor said, similar technology will make it possible to reconnect severed optic nerves too. So in lectures, he says he's enabling the lame to walk and blind to see, and even though this gets a laugh, he's not kidding. A list of Tor's other projects, one may consult Wikipedia, is impossibly long and impressive. It includes creating nano cars, each of which is comprised of a single molecule. James Tor's 2005 article about this, titled Directional Control in Thermally Driven Single Molecule Nanocars, was ranked the most accessed journal article by the American Chemical Society. These are molecules he creates in the lab that are essentially tiny cars with independently moving axles, wheels, and chassis. And each of them has a motor fueled by light. This is not science fiction, but it is science, true science. Tor explains that if 30,000 or so of these molecular cars were parked side by side, they would take up the width of a human hair. Tor knows better than most that manipulating literal atoms to build molecules is almost inconceivably labor-intensive, requiring innumerable protocols and careful steps. So he speaks with great authority on this subject and on the question of whether life emerged randomly 4 billion years ago. He says emphatically that based on what we now know, and on what he knows better than almost anyone, the idea is undeniably preposterous. The idea that life emerged randomly 4 billion years ago is utterly, undeniably preposterous, based on what we now know. Tor was the one who first explained to Metaxas what Metaxas has been saying, that in the 7 decades since the Miller-Urey experiment, we have not moved 1 angstrom closer to understanding how life emerged from non-life. And if you hear Tor's videos on his YouTube channel, you will hear Tor say the same thing. You will hear him say that we don't know how life emerged from non-life. Science can't tell us. Tor is a Christian. So he believes that God created life, but he is a scientist, and he will say that as a scientist, he cannot say how life emerged. Even though as a Christian, he knows what the Bible says about that, but he can't say that as a scientist, strictly speaking. Thanks to the work of many scientists over the decades, we've come to see how deeply ignorant we really are about what happened when life leapt into being from the infinite abyss of non-life. Tor makes clear that only by knowing as much as we do now, having tried and failed over these 70 years, we can truly fathom our ignorance on the subject of how life began, how life came from non-life. In 1952, we could imagine that we were very far along in figuring this out, but now we know far too much to think that. We now know enough to know how truly ignorant we are. But Tor says the real problem is that the scientists are mostly too stubborn to admit that this is the case. They won't admit how ignorant we are on the origin of life. They won't admit that we are not close to figuring this out. They so want to believe the thesis paradigm put forth by Miller and Urey that they ignore the obvious conclusions of their experiments and keep approaching the problem the same way, pretending that very soon we will finally see what we want to see. But Tor knows too much to be taken in. He knows that what they're purporting to be so close to showing actually can never be shown, despite all their efforts and all their claims. Tor says it cannot ever happen. They're fudging it. But I know that they're fudging it, and most people, and even most scientists, don't know enough to argue with them. Tor says, but he does. Tor says he's calling them out on it. Tor is fed up. Tor says we should defund all further research in this direction because we know now for sure that it's looking like it's like looking for a pot of gold at the end of each rainbow. It's demonstrably a fool's errand, and now it's a gigantic waste of money that could be put to better use, end quote by Tor. Of course, the decades of failure are part of the scientific process too. We often learn that our assumptions were wrong, and we have to regroup and make a paradigm shift. But philosophical biases are often at odds with what the science shows us. Many who learned Aristotle's view of the universe refused to accept Copernicus's. Many Newtonian physicists bristled at Einstein's theories, and most recently many steady-state proponents were loath to accept the idea of the Big Bang. This is human nature. For some reason, the force of ideological inertia often seems to be approaching infinity. Now we're going to look at the unbridgeable chasm between life and non-life. Nonetheless, Dr. Tor knows too much to be very patient with any foot-dragging on this score. He knows precisely how impossible it is to create life from inorganic chemicals and can get specific. In a recent speech, Tor said, quote, "First of all, we don't know how to build the 4 classes of molecules that are needed for life. And even if we had those 4 classes of molecules, we don't know how to assemble them even into the simplest bacterium. We don't know how to do that. Anyone who would say something contrary doesn't know what they're talking about. Show me the demonstration," Tor says. Nobody's ever done it, and it's not because of lack of effort. It's not because of lack of will. First of all, they haven't been able to get the molecules to do this, and if they could make the molecules, even if we were to give them the molecules, they wouldn't have the information. There would be no inherent information in the DNA. But even if we gave them the DNA and the structure that they wanted, they wouldn't know how to put all the components together because of the sophistication within a cell. The interactomes, meaning the interacting connectivity between the molecules, the van der Waals interactions, all these have to be in the right place and in the right order for a cell to function. We don't even know how to define life, let alone how to spark it to begin, end quote. The more one talks about this subject, the more strange and more confusing things become. What Dr. Tor says is quite true. We can't even define life, much less know how it was created 4 billion years ago to begin to create it ourselves. In fact, when you read back through that quote by Tor on this slide, it just speaks of acquiring intelligence to do it all. And it's ironic to me that these scientists, many of which are atheistic in nature, they're applying all of this intelligence to the parts of the cell to try to put these things together in such a way to create life. They haven't done it. But even if they somehow were able to do it, all they're proving is that it takes an incredible amount of intelligence to do it. But all that a Christian believes, like Tor, like me, is that somebody with infinite intelligence did it. But we can't do it. The smartest scientists in the world can't do it because their intelligence, as great as it is finite. The more we know how complex even the simplest life is, the less we can even say what life is. This too has over time become an increasingly mystifying mystery. What is life? In a way, trying to define life is something like when Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart, pictured right, in 1964, had to determine whether a certain film was pornography. This required defining what pornography was in the first place, to which he famously said, quote, "I shall not today attempt to further define what kinds of material I understand to be embraced within that shorthand description, and perhaps I could never succeed in intelligibly doing so. But I know it when I see it," end quote. Beyond that, he could not say very much. Isn't that how many of us might define life? Beyond that description, even the greatest biologists are stymied to a sheer standstill. When exactly does a human being cease to be alive? In one moment there's life, and in another death. What is it that precisely changes from the one moment to the next? And on the other end of the life spectrum, where we are talking about the simplest life forms, single-celled organelles, how do we define them? The science writer John Castee, in his book Paradigms Lost, probably put it as succinctly and clearly as possible. Quote by Castee in Paradigms Lost. Castee says, quote, "By more or less general consensus nowadays," Castee writes, "an entity is considered to be alive if it has the capacity to carry out three basic functional activities: metabolism, self-repair, and replication," end quote by Castee. It's easy enough to understand what self-repair and replication mean, yet the complexity involved in these concepts is almost inconceivable, and yet who can easily define metabolism? One dictionary says it is the sum of the physical and chemical processes in an organism by which its material substance is produced, maintained, and destroyed, and by which energy is made available. Quote. The simple fact is that we're talking about the most staggeringly complex things, and the most science has learned over the decades, and the more science has learned over the decades, the more complexity we see. So when we come to the subject of how the first life came into being from non-life, we're talking about something that once seemed easy to postulate, but that has since become, over time, essentially inconceivable even to the greatest minds of science. Is it any wonder no one has ever been able to show how it happened? In 1977, in Physics Today, Ilya Prigogine, who won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, said, quote, "The probability that at ordinary temperatures a macroscopic number of molecules is assembled to give rise to the coordinated functions characterizing living organisms is vanishingly small. The idea of spontaneous genesis of life in its present form is therefore improbable, even on the scale of billions of years," end quote. Time is the enemy. Some people argue that there's a chance these things could happen in hundreds of millions of years, but Tor explains that time can be the enemy when it comes to organic synthesis. Many of the chemicals needed are kinetic products. They're not thermodynamically stable. For example, carbohydrates, the main class of compounds, are the units that hook together DNA. They're the units that have identifying aspects on cell structure. These are the units that the cell is going to need for the energy of life. But once they form, they begin to decompose. Or says, quote, "Unless somebody is there to fish them out, to stop the process, and put them in a bottle under the inert conditions in a freezer, they go away as quickly as they came into being." Tor explains there are many other similar problems. For example, if random processes somehow succeeded in miraculously creating a carbohydrate or another necessary compound, the random processes don't know how to do it again. They have no capacity to learn. If they happen to hit it just right by accident, they have no ability to say, "Let's try that again." Tor says, quote, "Say it took you 400 million years to get to a certain point on synthesis, but now you have to go back and make more. But how do you go back and make more? Nature never kept a laboratory notebook. So even if it could make more, it doesn't know how to. So it's got to start all over again. But it doesn't know how to. It doesn't know why to start over again because it doesn't know what it's going toward," end quote. In other words, we now know that because there's zero intentionality in random processes happening over time, the assumptions we've made aren't reasonable. In fact, they're fanciful and wildly unrealistic. But if they suited the narrative that these things happen without a divine hand guiding them. Yes, the unreasonable assumptions are made. They are unreasonable, they are fanciful, they are unrealistic, but they did suit the narrative that these things happened without a divine hand guiding them. But Tor has no qualms about saying that the science is now very clear that this cannot have been what happened. And it's time to stop pretending. So it's Tor says to stop the research. Dr. Tor underscores the lack of progress in origin of life research since 1952 by talking about the stunning progress we've accomplished in other fields in that time. We've had human spaceflight, he says. We've had satellite connectivity. We have the internet. We have the entire silicon era of microchips and computer technology. We have all this in the same 2/3 of the century, but the origin of life research, we're still exactly where Miller and Urey were, end quote. Scientists working on this have succeeded in making some of the chemicals, but are, quote, nowhere close to even knowing how to hook them together in the proper order. We're clueless on this, clueless because time doesn't solve this, even with all our ingenuity, end quote. In explaining why the current research has not solved the problem and cannot solve the problem, Tor reiterates the idea that the eons of time we believed were the reason we could trust this direction in abiogenesis research has been shown to be the very reason we can no longer trust this direction. Again, time only exacerbates our problems. Tor says time's not going to solve the problem. Yet these chemicals that have been made sit around for months, even for months, and you can see that even in the origin of life researchers themselves, when they've let these go for weeks, they show the degradation of these in a period of weeks. Weeks is the twinkling of an eye when it comes to prebiotic timescales, end quote. So the notion that this sort of thing might have happened out in the wild of the oceans billions of years ago becomes even more ridiculous. Tor goes on, quote, the chemicals decompose. The ammonia environment in the cell itself is quite basic. You're going to have extended aldo reactions coming on. So think that the molecules could be made and sit there waiting for other molecules to come in. It doesn't happen. Organic chemistry doesn't work that way. Any student that is lazy enough to set up reactions and likes to go home for the weekend without working them up pays the price for that. With a depressed yield, generally, as soon as the reactions are done, or as soon as what you want is the optimized yield, you have to stop that reaction and get away from the starting materials, or else what happens is it polymerizes product. Especially when you're making kinetic products, which is not the thermodynamically most stable product, which is exactly what you get in many of the chemicals that are needed for life. So time is actually the enemy, end quote. But then Tor circles back to another even more frightening problem, which we've touched on already, which has to do with the absolutely absurd complexity of what we're trying to achieve. Tor says the protein interactions alone can take place in yeast cell are impossible to comprehend. Words really can't do justice to the astronomical odds. The numbers involved can only be found deep in the territory of madness. Remember, Tor says, that just the protein interactions in a single yeast cell are 10 to the 79 billion combinations. End quote. In case we're not clear on what he just said, he reminds us that the number of elemental particles in the universe is 10 to the 90th. That's 1 with 90 zeros after it, but the combinations of just protein-to-protein interactions in a single yeast cell is 10 to the 79 billion. That's not a 1 with 90 zeros after it, but a 1 with 79 billion zeros after it. These are the types of numbers we're talking about, end quote. And in case we're not convinced yet, he reminds us that the thousands of proteins that need to be just right are just the beginning of what we face. In addition to just those 3,000 proteins in that single yeast cell, you still need all the DNA, all the RNA. You need to have all the carbohydrates. Remember, the carbohydrates have all their own definition ordered by the way they're hooked up. You can put more information in the carbohydrates that are on a cell surface than you store in the DNA and RNA combined. And that information has to come from an original DNA template, plus a series of other enzyme cascades. All of this is in that cell, in addition to those interactomes. It's very complex. End quote. So it would seem. And again, we are throwing some of the best scientific minds at this problem. And the greatest amount, the cream of the crop, as far as the human intelligence goes toward figuring this problem out, and they're nowhere closer. Could it be that that's the case because someone of infinite intelligence is the author of life? Just throwing that out there. So that concludes Chapter 7 in Is Atheism Dead by Eric Metaxas. Next time is Chapter 8, more on the origins of life. Now what? So, please like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for tuning in. Please consider supporting this ministry by purchasing the published work, Pinnacles and Plateaus, Meditations with the Psalmist, if you can find that available where books are sold. If you can't find it where books are sold, please consider contacting me directly. I can send you a copy if I still have them on hand. So, thank you for tuning in, and I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.